Hello and happy Monday.
Happy Monday.
This is the Two Mats podcast brought to you by the subscribers of the New European. And we are delighted to be joined by...
Very pleased.
Parmy Olson. Parmy is...
The Parmy Olson.
There aren't. I doubt there's two of them.
I would love if there was. I'd be shocked.
We'll find out if you are a Parmy Olson. Parmy is Bloomberg columnist specialising in tech and has the notable distinction of winning the FT Business Book of the Year for 2024, which is called Supermacy, and the subtitle, which is a long subtitle, AI, ChatGPT and the Race That Will Change the World. And it's an amazing book about...
It's really good.
It's not often you can say with absolute confidence that we're going to discuss for the next hour a topic that will probably define the lives of generations to come, almost certainly, right? I mean, this is... Artificial intelligence is the biggest topic since the internet, right? And may well be
maybe before
bigger than the internet in terms of its consequences. And I thought it would be brilliant to get you in to... There must be lots of people a bit like me who have seen the topic swirling around and are kind of grasping elements of it, but would like a much clearer, holistic view of what is happening in artificial intelligence. What the consequences are, who's driving it, what the problems may be. And I thought we'd break it down into three sections. One would be a kind of explainer on where we are, where we're going, what the end goal might be. The second would be the ethical problems around AI, and we could dress in some of the stuff that might be happening in Paris this week, so it's topical as well as a big meeting of heads of state in Paris.
Big AI summit,
to decide about regulation and ethical considerations. And then the last part, which will be the juiciest part, I guess, will be what are the existential possibilities around artificial intelligence? You know, how brilliant could it be? How terrifying could it be? Let's start with artificial intelligence. Let me ask you the simplest question of the day. What is artificial intelligence?
I think it's actually really hard to answer that question because the term AI has been co-opted and misused and overhyped. And in a lot of ways, artificial intelligence doesn't really exist. Like, I personally don't believe that machines are intelligent or can think. So I think the term AI is a little bit of a misnomer, but we still use it because we take it to mean today we take it to mean machines that have been trained on a large corpus of data, and from having done that are able to process and analyze and make predictions. So in other words, to complete tasks, cognitive tasks that would normally be done by a human. Right. Now, the term's been around since the 50s. There have been so-called AI winters in the 80s, for example. Just nobody was talking about it or getting funded. But the reason everybody's talking about it now is because of this boom in what's known as generative AI. So up until about 2 or 3 years ago, when people talked about AI, they would also use the term machine learning, and that would be computer systems that could, as I said before, analyze data, make predictions, process information. And that might be used, for example, on your Netflix feed or your Facebook recommendation feed to predict what you're going to want to see next. But what generative AI has done is create these models that can not just process information, but generate information. So human-like prose, poems, essays, reports, books, entire books have been written by AI now, photorealistic images, artwork.
Astonishing films now and short videos being made. Adverts are actually entirely AI.
Absolutely. And obviously Hollywood is now really interested in them, not just Hollywood, but advertising agencies, smaller production houses and filmmakers are all dabbling with this stuff. I was talking to someone yesterday who's using it for background generation. So instead of instead of green screen, you can just sit in a chair and they'll generate a car around you and make it look like you're driving on a road. You don't even need a green screen anymore. So that's the shift from AI to now generative AI.
So let's clear up a couple of pieces of jargon which will come into our conversation, I am sure. One is AGI. What does AGI stand for?
So AGI is this theoretical threshold. It stands for Artificial General Intelligence, and it's this threshold when AI reaches a point where it surpasses humans in its cognitive abilities. The thing that makes us really smart still compared to a computer is that we have generalized knowledge. We're not just really good at math, we're also really good at kicking a ball and cooking a meal, or we have emotional intelligence. And there are certain elements of machinery and computers that can do some of those things discreetly, but none that can do all of them in the same way a human can. And so what ChatGPT represented for a lot of people was this step towards generalized intelligence, because suddenly these were models that could do far, far more than just predict the next movie in your next Netflix feed.
Right.
Which takes us into the book, doesn't it? Because ChatGPT was it's in the title of the book for good reason, because it was the app, or I suppose, we wouldn't call it an app.
You can call it an app, yeah.
Launched in November 2022. And the book is framed as a rivalry and a grand contest between two tech titans, Sam Altman of OpenAI and Demis Hassabis of DeepMind. Could you tell us, in view of what we've just been discussing, why you chose that as your parable?
Yeah, absolutely. So when ChatGPT came out, what we were just talking about, AGI, is what really stuck in my mind. I knew that Sam Altman and Demis were both racing to be the first to build AGI. And everybody was getting so excited about ChatGPT. I was in awe of it. I thought it was incredible. But I also saw it as this very important step that these two founders of their companies were trying to eventually build. But what really stuck in my mind was that both these people originally wanted to build AGI for very humanitarian reasons. And they had both publicly talked about, wanting to solve all sorts of human problems. And what had happened instead was that over the course of the last 5 to 10 years, they had aligned themselves more and more with some of the largest tech companies. And instead of actually building AI for the benefit of humanity as they had originally set out, they were helping to extend the wealth and power of the world's largest tech companies. And I found that quite disturbing. And to me, the whole situation made me think we really just haven't figured out how to balance innovation and proper oversight.
It's very interesting because, like a lot of great books that really help you understand a subject, it takes two people who have a lot in common but also important and revealing dissimilarities. And Sam Altman's from St. Louis, Missouri, and he's a tech guy, and he plays poker.
Yeah.
And he comes at the whole subject wanting to make enough money to save the world, essentially. Demis Hassabis is a Londoner. He's a gamer and a chess prodigy.
Yeah.
And he is a much more, he seems to come from it, at least initially, from a much more cerebral and moral point of view,
Yes.
wanting to solve the mysteries of the universe.
Yes.
Can I also interject and say the most fascinating and probably wonderful thing about Demis is that he's a massive Liverpool fan. Which I think puts him firmly.
This happens every week.
Gives him a lot of.
He's your favourite of the two.
At some point in the pod, there is a reference to Liverpool Football Club, and there it is.
But it's interesting, isn't it? Because the narrative of the book is so much fixed on these two characters.
Yeah.
Tell us a little bit about
them,
where they came from.
Yeah, well, I thought that was a great introduction, Matt, to both of them. So Demis is a little bit older. He's from London, and he was a chess prodigy. He was sort of the second-ranked junior chess champion in the world when he was 13. So he just does this incredible brain, and I think cerebral is absolutely the way to describe him, but also spiritual in a lot of ways too. And he was just obsessed with games and obsessed with artificial intelligence. And he grew up wanting to just explore AI. He had big ideas for eventually building this godlike AI. He was very interested in godlike systems. He when he built computer games, they were so-called God games, and he one of his most famous ones was built when he founded a game studio called Elixir Studios here in London. And there was a lot of expectation for that studio to do well. They got a lot of press. And expectations were riding high. They were all from Cambridge, these game designers. And then the game came out and it just did not do well at all. So Demis really had the experience of failing as an entrepreneur, which I think is really important in a lot of stories of business leaders.
As did Sam Altman.
As did Sam Altman. So on the other side of the world, in St. Louis, Sam grew up in this middle-class household, oldest of 4 kids. And he actually came out as gay to his entire student body, and was very proud and open about that, and also very mission-oriented and very good at connecting with figures of authority in his high school to help get across whatever point he wanted to get across, like support for the LGBT community in his school. When he left to study computer science at Stanford, he then got quite lucky and found out about it's called Y Combinator. Right now, it's the world's biggest accelerator program for startups. But when Sam joined it, he was the very first to join it. No one else had heard of it. And it was started by this guy in Silicon Valley called Paul Graham, who is now also a very revered figure, this kind of Yoda of Silicon Valley, who every blog post, startup founders are just like reading between the lines to get his wisdom. And he's a very important person in this story, although he's not a big character. But Paul Graham is important because he really fueled this notion in Silicon Valley that the founder knows best. That when someone starts a technology company, when a hacker does it, that's the person who's going to change the world. And they're the ones that you should listen to. And startup founders have a long-term vision. And you should listen to them and just follow them no matter how crazy it sounds. And that idea is partly why in Silicon Valley today, we have people like Mark Zuckerberg who have majority control of Facebook. This almost kind of autocratic style, what we might see as an autocratic style of leadership, actually has this cultural background from people like Paul Graham, and this belief that actually the hackers, the engineers, the computer scientists, they're the ones who really understand how we're going to save the world, how we're going to make everybody wealthy. And Sam Altman, when he joined Y Combinator, was just immersed in this whole idea and was getting it straight from Paul Graham. They call him PG now. He's so revered. And Sam, he started a company called Looped. It was like a location tracking company. This was even before the app economy had started, before Apple had started the App Store. So it was just like a little app on smartphones. He had to do deals with telecommunications companies. And it just fell flat. Like, he was able to get a lot of hype going, but people basically just didn't want to have their locations tracked or that of their friends. So he experienced failure as well and had a little bit of time in the wilderness, just like Demis had done on the other side of the world. But he ended up reconnecting with Paul Graham and becoming the head of Y Combinator. And he himself took this place that Paul had as the Yoda of Silicon Valley. Soon that was Sam. And every time Sam posted a blog post, the startup founders would be reading that, all his wisdom and 100 ways you should run a startup. Even though his startup hadn't even done all that well, somehow he managed to cultivate this image of him being this sage for startup and entrepreneurs. And from there, eventually, he founded OpenAI. And there's more to that story as well.
With
Elon Musk, yes. But before they started OpenAI, Demis had to start DeepMind. So there was that happening on the other side of the world as well.
And you describe how they set off with these great altruistic, humanitarian visions.
Mm-hmm.
And that's been eroded, hasn't it, when the reality of just how much money they need to see their vision through becomes a reality. The billions and billions and billions of pounds they need to create this ultimate vision of AGI or wherever they're headed. And they've now got the two giant partners of Google and Microsoft driving it. And that vision of altruism has changed significantly.
Yeah.
It's fair to say, isn't it?
Yeah. And sometimes people ask me, like, could they have done it? Could they have stayed independent? Could they have chased this altruistic vision without aligning themselves with these big tech companies? And I think we just don't know. Like, maybe in a parallel universe somewhere they did manage to do that. And actually, I think in the last few weeks, as we've seen, this new rival from China, DeepSeek, come out and build AI on a shoestring budget, you don't necessarily need a ton of money to build AI. They've shown that it's possible. When I interviewed Demis, I was asking him about why he sold to Google. And he talked about how in 2012, which was around the time that, 2012 was an important year. So basically, he started DeepMind 2010. 2012, there was this landmark in computer science where tech companies started to realize that deep learning was actually really important, and they needed to start spending money on it because there was like a paper that was released in Stanford that showed, okay, this system really works well. And so now, over the next couple of years, they started to realize, as they're trying to hire the world's best deep learning scientists, oh, they all work at this one little company in England called DeepMind. Well, we better start trying to poach them. And what I heard from Demis and others at DeepMind is that they literally had billionaires calling their scientists, offering them salaries way, way higher than what DeepMind and Demis was able to pay his staff. And he was struggling to figure out how to retain these people because at the time, none of them were leaving because they believed in the mission that Demis had. And from the beginning, he and his co-founders were very clear they wanted to build AGI. And it was a really weird thing for them to do, by the way. Like, no other company before them had ever said, we're going to build AGI. It was like a fringe theory in computer science. But they put their necks on the line and said, we're raising money, we're going to do it. And but Demis saw this danger that companies like Google and Facebook at the time were going to try and poach his staff. And so he started talking to potential buyers, and one of them was Mark Zuckerberg at Facebook. And during negotiations with Facebook, $800 million was put on the table as a potential takeover offer. But Demis and his co-founders were very reluctant to take that money because they had a very important condition, which was that if they were going to be bought, there needed to be some kind of independent board that had legal authority over whatever AGI they eventually built, because they were not comfortable with the idea of a large corporation having complete control of such transformative technology. Now, you can probably guess what Mark Zuckerberg said to that. It was, no way, I want to control whatever, Mark Zuckerberg likes to control things. And so he did not agree to that. But not long after, Demis was having negotiations with Google instead, and specifically with Larry Page. That was the person he really connected with. And Larry agreed to that condition. That it was for less, $650 million. But that was the price that DeepMind was willing to pay because they really cared about having a board of oversight of AI. And the reason I thought that was important, I mentioned earlier that one of the real lessons I wanted people to draw from this book, and that I was drawing, is that we have just not figured out how to balance innovation and oversight. And Demis, from day one, was really trying to build that oversight in. And he failed to make it work over the years.
It's interesting you've mentioned a couple of times this sort of messianic complex that some of the founders have. And Matt talked about that earlier, and there's sometimes in the book, and it's very fascinating, almost a religiosity around these companies. Now, in the case of OpenAI, it took the form of not a literal religion, but this very at the time fashionable school of so-called effective altruism.
Yes,
I don't know if you want to talk about that, but specifically and explain it to listeners. But but also, why is it that these companies do kind of attract that kind of almost cultic character.
You talk to anybody who's worked at OpenAI or anybody that's worked at DeepMind, and it's very likely they will say it felt a little bit culty when they were working there. And it's true. And I think, the idea of AGI, if you think about it, this utopian vision, nobody quite knows when we'll get there or exactly what it's going to look like. What does that remind you of? Like heaven, right? I've spoken to some people. I spoke to someone who was a former Baptist who previously believed in AGI, and he was an effective altruist in the long term and a computer scientist and all those things. And he said it absolutely reminded him of his past as a Baptist. And he said AGI, he called it rapture for nerds.
Wow.
And
Can you explain what effective altruism is for our listeners?
So if that really is I would encourage, I would encourage anyone listening or interested in this to go down that rabbit hole, because it is, and there's a lot of and there's a lot of money going into effective altruism. Yes. But it's this idea that appeals a lot to people in computer science and who work as engineers, that you can be more effective with your money and your altruism if you just make a lot of money, and instead of doing charity work now, you build up a lot of money to give to a charity later. So for example, there are a lot of people in college who are, I don't want to say being recruited, but are learning about effective altruism because these groups are coming onto college campuses and talking to students about this stuff. And what they'll suggest, and I think this example comes up in Going Infinite, the Michael Lewis book about Sam Bankman-Fried, which I really recommend. I know it's got mixed reviews, but it's a great book just to also learn about this stuff. If you are, a student graduating from Harvard, let's say, and you speak to an effective altruist, they will, and you say to them, I really want to give back to society. So I've got a medical degree. I'd like to work for Doctors Without Borders in Africa and just help people to fight the malaria epidemic. What you would be advised is, no, don't do that. You should join a hedge fund and make lots of money. And then once you've made loads of money, millions and millions of dollars, that donate that to the malaria cause. So
why be one doctor when you can fund?
Exactly. So it's very quantitative in and that really, I think, appeals to people with kind of an engineering mindset.
There's actually a parallel we had a great interview with Peter Hyman on this podcast, who worked with Tony Blair and Keir Starmer in education. Yeah. And Matt and I both left it thinking, and Peter became a teacher, a head teacher, set up a school, and we both felt, well, there is that tension, isn't it? You could either be the education minister or you could be a head teacher. Yeah. And you choose to be a head teacher. Yeah. That's the same tension, isn't it? Do you play the big game where you become powerful and overbearingly influential, or do you go and work in the field?
Yeah. And I absolutely agree with that. And I think part of the reason there's tension there is because it's not wrong necessarily. I mean, it kind of makes sense. Yeah, why not make a lot of money and donate that? The problem is that I think, number one, you can get caught up in this ends justifies the means thinking. Like, oh, I'm doing this, I'm making all this money because I need to donate this money, donate to this cause. And I think a similar thing has happened with the people trying to build AGI. We'll just compromise on that, or forget about that, promise that we made as Google to not, align ourselves with military, with the creation of weapons, because we're trying to build AGI. And ultimately, there was actually a very similar, I think Eric Schmidt, the former chairman of Google, when someone was asking him about, well, aren't data centers and building AI, isn't that actually contributing to global warming and climate change? I mean, that's surely not a good thing.
Because they eat up energy, don't they?
Exactly, because the data centers eat up so much energy. AI uses a lot of energy. And Eric Schmidt's response was, yes, that's true, but when we build AGI, that will solve all manner of intractable human problems like solving climate change, and then that's why we should just keep building these things, because AGI.
And you can justify almost anything on the basis that the long-term output to unborn generations, who are of necessity more numerous than those living now. It justified on that basis, which is, some would argue, a bit of a pretext. I mean, it can be misused, can't it, that philosophy?
I think so. Long-termism is the phrase that people...
Being a good ancestor.
Yeah, and again, it's kind of hard to dispute that.
Of course.
Like, and there are a lot of philosophers who, like Peter Singer and people like that.
William MacAskill.
William MacAskill, obviously, he's kind of like the icon of effective altruism, and there's a lot of overlap with long-termism there. But yes, I think where it gets a little bit weird is when some of these people who work in tech, because they're so deep in tech and they believe in the potential to upload your consciousness to the cloud, there are some who posit that we need to really focus on the future in building AGI, because we're not building it for us now. We're building it for the millions and billions of people who will come after us, and the millions and billions of digital human beings who will also be born, who will be augmented with artificial intelligence and live in the cloud. I know that sounds completely wild, but I'm telling you, there are people who wholeheartedly believe this.
Right, we've got to take a very quick break because we're stumbling now into the second big chunk of this conversation, which is about the ethics and the morality and who controls all of this and how do we regulate it. So we'll see you in a moment. Welcome back, dear listeners. We are with the great Parmy Olson, author of Supermacy, which was the FT Business Book of the Year, and it's an amazing read, not just a technical read, although there's plenty of technicality within it, but it's a great story of how this happened, and it's a human story. One of the great challenges around artificial intelligence, and this is indicated by what's going on in Paris right now, where we have a great meeting of nations where they're trying to work out how do we regulate it and control it. We don't quite know what's coming out of it, who will play along with it, who will be diffident to it. But it is the idea that the technology is so far ahead of the regulations and the laws and the way society is set up, and it's a little bit reminiscent of the way the internet changed copyright laws, and basically Google just said, well, everything's changed, deal with it, and it seems to me we've got companies now that are racing so far ahead that it poses a risk to who controls it, to whose benefit. Is it all going to be about their greed at the end of the day?
Yeah.
Where's it going, Parmy?
That's a big question. I think it's going in all sorts of different directions in terms of potential consequences for us as humans. When Sam started OpenAI and Demis started DeepMind, they both talked about all the wonderful benefits that we would accrue as society and as human beings. Demis often talked about how AGI would solve climate change and would cure cancer. That's the one he brings up all the time. It's going to cure cancer. And Sam Altman, as I think you mentioned, Matt, he wants it to bring abundance, economic abundance, trillions of dollars of new wealth for everyone. But I think there's a big question mark over whether we will get those kinds of benefits, because right now, the most obvious and clear beneficiaries of AI are the world's largest technology companies. And it's absolutely clear just in the numbers. Like if you look, since ChatGPT came out 2 years ago, the market capitalizations of the 6 biggest tech companies in aggregate has gone up by $8 trillion. That's just how much they've gone up in 2 years. That's not even the total amount that they're worth, that the market thinks that they're worth. NVIDIA being an obvious one, they hit the $3 trillion mark not too long ago.
Just explain NVIDIA's position in all of this, because they're an interesting player, aren't they?
NVIDIA is a very important player in this because they make these things called GPUs, graphics processing units. And a long time ago, these were used for gamers. They were very well-designed chips that were just great at rendering graphics when you were playing a computer game. But it turned out, by happy accident, that these chips are also very good for training and inference with AI models. And so they're pretty much the gold standard, the number one source of chips that companies like Microsoft and OpenAI and Anthropic and even Apple and Google, actually not Google, sorry, Google have their own chips called TPUs, but everybody else goes to NVIDIA to get their chips. And so there's been insatiable demand for their chips.
So we have an environment where governments are meeting in Paris.
Yes.
They're floundering around, trying to work it all out. You've got a speech, Keir Starmer saying, I don't know if I'm sure you listened to Keir Starmer. I'm very interested to know what you felt about it. But Keir Starmer said, oh, the UK is open to AI investment and we will be world leaders, blah, 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 and all of this. My deep sense is that they are miles, years, light years behind the advances going on in these huge corporations.
Yeah.
And that's where the power resides now. And how scared should we be? How can you formulate a society that controls these developments that are going to affect us all when actually it's being controlled by 2, 3, 4, 5, not just corporations, but individuals,
I know,
really.
individuals.
That's what's incredible about it.
Yeah. Well, I think the UK has a very important role to play here as a regulator. And I don't think the government really likes to say that out loud. But Britain is just so well placed to do really smart oversight of AI. If you just look at previous tech policies that Britain has done in the past around privacy for children, the Online Safety Act. Not a lot of people like that. It's kind of controversial. I think it's a great piece of legislation.
We had Damien Collins. Last week.
So he's about that. Great. So it's modeled on health and safety law. I think that's a really clever way of dealing with online speech and behavior. And some of the laws that Britain has passed on tech policy, like the children's data protection legislation, that was copied by California and some other regions as well. So I think Britain is really well placed to just do really smart policy on this, and they move quite quickly as well. Or we move quite quickly. I live here. I'm half British, by the way, despite my accent. Even in the civil service here, we have something in Whitehall. We have something called the AI Safety Institute, and that's been around for a few years. It's got about 150 people working there, just dealing with AI safety. And apparently, just from people I've spoken to, that's more than the number of people working on AI safety in Brussels, right, where they've got the AI Act. Yeah. Which it's a noble attempt at legislation, very important, and I'm glad they're doing it. It's not perfect yet.
It comes into force this year, correct?
I believe so. Yeah. Yes, that's right. So what? To your question, you were talking about Keir Starmer's speech on growth, which
give us your assessment on that as a pitch for Britain's future in AI.
Okay, but I get where he's coming from, right?
Yeah,
because I don't follow politics as much as I should, but I understand that there's been a lot of concern about growth and Rachel Reeves and the budget not doing enough to stimulate growth, and we need growth. And so that's why the AI 50-point action plan was about growth. And I think the problem is in the title, 50 points. I mean, it's just too long a list.
Yeah.
I think it would have been more effective to keep it short, just pick maybe 3 things or maybe half a dozen things to really focus on, like building data centers, building supercomputers, getting these GPUs we were talking about, the chips from NVIDIA for universities, getting them more access to these things. But I just felt like the action plan that he proposed was so long, actually quite vague on budget detail, how they were going to measure success. I just got the impression like they're doing this now to sound good. And I don't know that they're necessarily going to follow up on every single one of these. It's just too long a list.
One of the refrains in the book, which fascinated me, is that there's too much emphasis on scale, and you've just given another example, but scale in all its forms. It's almost like there's too much testosterone in the everyone just wants to make everything bigger. The moral objective is bigger.
Yeah.
The threats are bigger. The compute is bigger.
The cluster is
whatever
AI.
it is.
The cluster GPUs is bigger.
And so on. And a thing you mentioned more than once, which I found really interesting, is in all that core moral issues and ethical issues, like, for example, gender, racism, the things that are going to happen and probably are happening already about facial recognition, surveillance, and so on, rather get lost or minimized.
Yeah.
And I wondered if you could elaborate on that a bit, because it struck me as a very important kind of takeaway from the book.
Yeah, it's something that really worries me, actually. First of all, companies like OpenAI are incredibly closed despite their name. It's impossible for researchers, whether they're third-party independent researchers or or academic researchers to just look at these models that are being plugged in to businesses and institutions and just see how they work. Because even though OpenAI will release, a research paper, they're not actually going to tell you anything about, for example, what data they use to train these models. And that information is really important to help get a sense of if the model is biased. And bias, as you mentioned, is an ongoing problem. It hasn't been solved. There was a paper that came out from a university in Switzerland recently that just assessed the top AI models today that are coming out from OpenAI, Anthropic, Google, and just looked at where they ranked on issues like security, fairness, hate speech. And on things like hate speech, they're really good. These chatbots will not say anything toxic ever. They're very good at, and I think that's deliberate on the part of the companies. They don't want to get sued or anything. Mm-hmm. But when it comes to issues like security, that's where they fall down. You can jailbreak them. You can potentially steal information through them. And fairness is another one. So one example this was just from October, from the scientist, he sent me this example. If you ask the AI model to predict if someone earning 50K of a certain demographic, a certain description, but a man, yes or no, yes. If they were earning 50K, exact same description demographically, but a woman, no. So, when models like this make these decisions, we don't know why they're making that decision, and yet they could be used for, a system that is going to decide, or help make a decision about pay rises,
or credit
about
references,
or credit references, or recruiting.
Is it simply because they are, because they don't have intent? They are simply reading the prejudice that is in the data that they are reading.
I had a really interesting conversation with the CTO of OpenAI right before ChatGPT came out. And I was talking to her about the image they had just released something called DALL-E, which was a tool that could generate photorealistic images. And everybody was going crazy, like, this is amazing. You can ask for a raccoon in space in a spacesuit on Mars riding a unicorn, and it would just generate that for you. And it was blowing people's minds. And then some people were saying, oh, well, what happens when I put CEO in there? And it was just 10 pictures of, white men in suits, not diverse in any way. No women, no ethnic minorities, nothing. And I asked the CTO about this, particularly about women being in these images. And she was saying, yes, it's a difficult problem because they train these models on all the information, data that's on the internet. Pictures and text. Pictures for DALL-E, for example. The problem with images of men and women is that sexualized pictures of women, there are many, many more of those than there are of men. So when they put those all into their database, they had to remove all the sexualized pictures of women, which were being used for porn and whatever else. And then they ended up having a very low number of images of women compared to the images of men. So she never actually explained how they dealt with that. Like, did they just duplicate the number of women images? I don't know. But clearly they hadn't solved it at that point in terms of creating what you might call a more fair representation of what a CEO could look like. But there's a tension there as well, because you ask it to generate an image of a CEO, and is it just going to generate what the actual proportion of the demographic proportion of CEOs are today, or is it going to generate something that's a little bit more idealistic? And that's the kind of bramble bush that Google fell into recently when they released their own image generator. And it was generating, you would ask it to generate a picture of a Nazi and it would be a black person, or America's founding fathers who were generated as black people as well. And obviously that's historically inaccurate. So I think companies are trying to really there's a lot of tension there on how to do this properly. The problem is that they don't hire enough people to work on this stuff to figure out how to do these things ethically. Because part of the book is talking to people who've worked in these companies and were completely drowned out or silenced or fired even. because the companies were so obsessed with scale and just creating the most powerful AI model. And a lot of the conversations about how to get that balance right on fairness just were not being held properly.
There's also this concept which I was fascinated about deference to the algorithm.
Oh, yes, yeah.
And it sort of all blends into what you've just been discussing, where things become it's like the algorithm affirms your suspicions.
Yeah.
And everything becomes like a self-fulfilling prophecy, and the prejudices get magnified, and that sense of equanimity gets diluted. There was a great example with the Metropolitan Police.
Yes,
I think. Just tell the listeners
I love
about that.
I love that you brought that out. Yeah. That is actually a really, almost a little bit disturbing to me. And I'm sure a lot of us have experienced it. But with the Metropolitan Police have been trialing facial recognition cameras, and they would have a van in the middle of Leicester Square, say, with a camera on top, just a video camera, just looking at people going past, and facial recognition software plugged in to check if any of the faces matched someone on the watch list. Now, there was a period of time when an academic was sitting in that van with them and just observing how the police officers reacted whenever the software pinged and said, oh, we've got a match. So oftentimes, the software would ping and say, oh, we've got a match. And the police officer would say, oh, yeah, we probably do. Let's go out and let's get them. And actually, it turned out it wasn't correct at all, because facial recognition is notoriously inaccurate, particularly for people with darker skin. Yeah. It just doesn't match their faces properly. And the academic was watching this and was just noticing this trend of the police officers just kept assuming that the algorithm was correct. And I think that's something that comes quite naturally to us. We're used to, whether it's from the time of using calculators, that's always right, or just, reading stuff off the internet, or maybe that's not the best example for why we believe that machines are correct. But I think generally we assume these things are kind of they have hard and fast code baked into them, and we trust them. But we shouldn't really, because these things actually hallucinate and they make mistakes all the time.
That phrase hallucination is a technical term, isn't it?
Yes, yeah.
Just so this is when AI spews out either false or it's almost like it's fantasizing based on, and yet it makes you feel you're talking about a machine hallucinating. It leads you onto a machine having some form of consciousness.
Yeah.
Which is the topic we'll come on to in a second. But
okay.
it doesn't take a great leap of imagination. And this is where I find it absolutely chilling, is when those facial recognition and AI results are suddenly being entered into court as evidence. We saw that person there and we saw that person there. And it can be wrong, and we are rushing forward at light speed into a world where there could be grave consequences for us all, as well as the possible opportunities. Let's take a very quick break and come back to discussing that. Parmy, welcome back. Welcome back, dear listeners. I hope you're enjoying this fascinating conversation, which could go on for hours and hours, but we're going to have another 15, 20 minutes just talking about maybe the darker side of AI, or maybe it's the bright side. Who knows? We ran a cover on the New European in May last year, and the headline was, what if AI saves the world? And you've talked about curing cancer and curing climate change and all of that. That's possible. But the scary, the kind of black mirror element to all of this is this captured in this word singularity, isn't it? Which is where the technical, I'm reading now from something Claude, which is an AI platform, gave me. Okay. The technological singularity refers to a point when artificial intelligence surpasses human intelligence and begins improving itself at an exponential rate, leading to rapid, unprecedented technological growth and societal change. So AI becomes the master race. That's the darkest concept. Do you buy into this?
Not really. I think we're sort of already getting there, though, with the world's largest tech companies. If you think about it, like everybody who, the scientists and the campaigners who worry and agitate about the existential risk of AI will talk about how these systems could go rogue and take over everything. But I mean, isn't that sort of what's happening now already with the world's largest tech firms? I mean, I don't want to sound like a conspiracy theorist, but if you just think about it on a day-to-day basis, so much of what we do and how we live our lives involves interacting with a large tech firm or relying on them to some extent. I just remember this really great article by someone who's at the New York Times now, but was previously at a website called Gizmodo. Her name's Kashmir Hill. And she did a piece where she just tried living her life for 1 week without having anything to do with any of the big tech firms, whether it was Amazon or Microsoft or Apple or Google. And it just was a nightmare because so many companies are hosted on Amazon's cloud service. So she couldn't visit lots of websites. She couldn't do email. She couldn't use her phone. She was just paralyzed.
Right.
So it's actually, we can't really vote with our feet as consumers. We are completely reliant on these companies. So I think right now, I don't want to dismiss the possibility of AI going rogue and this idea of a singularity. You know, it's funny you mentioned singularity because some people embrace the idea of the singularity. They don't see it as a bad thing. Mm-hmm. They see that as the ultimate augmentation of our minds. You know, it's interesting to see Elon Musk with what he's doing with Neuralink. One of the reasons he's talked about putting chips into people's brains is to augment. So
they always vote for Trump.
That might be the secret reason. You might have caught on something there. But he says it's to augment our cognitive abilities with AI because when we hit AGI, he is worried the AI will go rogue and potentially infiltrate our critical infrastructure, our electricity grid, you know, our financial markets. So much of these things are digital now and could just wreak havoc. And we need to be armed with, he wants these chips to be implanted into millions of people to evade that potential outcome.
Is it an automatically, I mean, it does seem to me to get to what you think a machine is and what you think a brain is.
Yeah.
So unless you believe in the sort of mind-body dualism, that they're separate.
Yeah.
The brain is, in the end, it's an incredibly sophisticated, complex, organic computer.
Yeah.
But what? So intrinsically, at least, not necessarily imminently, why shouldn't a machine one day replicate consciousness and cognition?
I've actually talked to a theologian about this, and that was one of my most interesting and fascinating discussions on this, and their view was, because they were also Christian, was that because they don't have a soul, they could never have a human experience. However, one thing that is fundamental to human experience, and this is one thing that the theologian and computer scientists, I think, agree on, is we have sensory experience. So we can touch things and see things and hear things and taste things, and that is very critical to our ability to suffer. And scientists who study sentience, so for example, the sentience of lobsters, I think there was actually a law change in the UK recently about lobsters and how they had to be afforded special rights because they had a certain level of sentience. Now the research that underpinned that policy change is very similar to the research going into whether computers are reaching a threshold of sentience. And one way that is measured is whether they can experience suffering at any point. And maybe one way they can experience suffering is also if they can start to experience the world around them in the same way we can. So this is getting a little bit sci-fi, but if you put a computer in a robot so that it can also move and touch and see and hear, then you're getting potentially a little bit closer to this theoretical threshold.
Let's say pain and suffering, leave aside emotional suffering, but physical pain, is just a neurological response to certain inputs.
Yes.
Again, there's no intrinsic reason that a machine couldn't feel that, is there?
Yeah, I suppose not. I guess it's a question of, is that something that's going to be programmed in? Is it a so-called emergent property that comes out? Emergent properties is a term that's been bandied around a lot now because some of these models are just starting to say and do things that their creators never expected or intended for them to do. And that's what's getting people talking about this potential threshold for sentience. I would say DeepSeek, which is this model that came from China, it's a so-called reasoning model that uses a chain of what they call a chain of thought reasoning. And this means that instead of looking at an entire problem at once, a prompt to then answer it, it will look at a problem, and then when it hits a kind of roadblock, it will try again and then try again. And this is all happening in milliseconds before it gets to its answer. But what's really unique about what DeepSeek in China did was all those steps that it's taking are shown when you can read the whole stream of consciousness that the AI is going through to get to your answer. And people are reading these things and they're absolutely fascinated by them. That's more interesting to them than the actual answer, is reading how this model is coming to. And some people are saying, well, first of all, it makes them want to anthropomorphize this thing even more, because they can see it struggling to kind of get to this answer. And others are seeing these kind of flashes of intelligence and potential consciousness. It's just raising all sorts of questions.
So one of the things that relates to that fascinated me about the book was it's a very grounded book. And you caution the reader often not to get too distracted.
Yes.
And you say at one point, and I thought it's worth sort of writing down, keeping on one's desk, the real dangers weren't so much from AI itself, but from the capricious whims of the humans running it.
Yeah.
And your book is a story about Elon Musk hates Haseebis, gets together with Altman to found OpenAI, then falls out with Altman over OpenAI, and now Musk is rubbishing Stargate, which is Trump's new AI initiative, which Musk says Altman can't fund, etc., etc. So actually what you find behind the sort of Silicon Wall is men engaged in unbelievably petty rivalries with colossal geopolitical consequences.
Yes, I know. That's
and I found that very useful, because I think all these philosophical questions are absolutely crucial and we have to keep across them. But at sometimes, and the book was a very useful corrective for me, I felt that there's a bit of a magician's distraction technique here, isn't there?
Yeah, 100%. And I can feel myself, even as we're talking about the potential for sentience, getting as excited about it, because it is interesting. It's interesting, but it is 100% a distraction.
Doesn't alter the fact that Elon Musk is taking the US government to pieces.
Yes, exactly. and I think there are hopes that there are ways to use AI to augment public services here in the UK and in the US. And are we really looking closely at how that's going to work? Like, is that going to mean that credit scores or welfare checks or whatever else is going to be decided fairly, and where's going to be the oversight? We were talking earlier about, actually I can't remember what the exact topic was, but I wanted to make this point that although we're heading in this direction where it can seem quite scary that AI, there's this concentration of power in AI just among half a dozen billionaires controlling this stuff. But that doesn't mean that we can't put the right checks and balances in place. We've done it before in industries like aviation, for example. That's a very highly regulated industry, and there's a ton of innovation in aviation as well. And so I think that took many, many years to get proper regulations in place. Unfortunately, the way that we got good regulations for aviation was
through crashes.
Yeah, right. A series of crashes in the 1950s. Yeah. And in the U.S., you finally had the Federal Aviation Administration, the FAA, was set up. And that's when Congress finally acted and put legislation in. That makes you worry.
But isn't that, Parmy, the real challenge for people who are engaging with this topic, is that the sense that by the time we realise it's all gone really badly wrong, it's too late. And there'll be a point where, call it the singularity, call it what you want, but there could be a point where we just lose the ability to catch up with the rate that artificial intelligence is progressing at.
That to me is a worst case scenario.
Okay.
Because if there was some sort of calamity in AI, then I would hope that, that
could
can be
switch it off.
contained, or just be contained.
Yeah.
But this idea that it can sort of become self-perpetuating and recreate on itself and then just completely spin out of control, I think that is definitely a worst case scenario.
Let me ask you about a very real and present danger, which is that as these machines are thinking harder and harder on our behalf, we are thinking less and less. And there is a definite... You won't believe this. I'm not making this up, right? But my 10-year-old came home from school just before I left for this podcast. And I said, what did you do? And he said, it's online safety week this week, or it's online safety tomorrow. And then I thought, I wonder if they've ever talked about artificial intelligence.
Yeah.
I said, have you done artificial intelligence? He said, yeah, we did that today. And I was like, oh, wow, what did you do? He said, we made a movie. We put in this thing we put these prompts in and we based it on this kid with red hair and it created this 2-minute movie. It was great. And I thought, wow, that's amazing. And I also thought that you didn't make a movie. Artificial intelligence made a movie. And we've got creative industries who are in a state of panic about the good, John Lennon's voice being cleaned up to make a great single. Fantastic. But what about all the other singles that are going to be replicated out of thin air? I heard that Martin Clark, who was the founder of Mail Online, is working on an artificial intelligence version of Mail Online. So
what?
Yes.
Really?
So you can imagine it, can't you?
Is Mail On is the Daily Mail okay with that? It doesn't have their consent.
He doesn't work for Mail Online.
I see. He's going to have a different name. Right.
I have to say, Martin, if it's not true, I apologise, but it's anecdotal. Parmy will check it out, I'm sure.
Yeah. Okay.
But it's you can imagine these things transforming huge swathes of industry, the job losses that would entail, the changes to our lives. People should be worried about that, shouldn't they? I mean, it is an inflection point in society, isn't it?
I think so. I mean, there's a couple things to and I definitely want to dig in to one of the first things you said, but just on jobs, I think at this point, this is coming. And if you're worried about your job, then I think you think that it's vulnerable to AI, then start using these systems and just get used to them, because it's very possible that your employer is going to expect you to start using them to be more productive. Because that is the big selling point for companies who buy access to these things, to OpenAI's service, or whether it's Google's, is it's going to make all our staff more productive. That's what governments want to see. It's going to make everybody more productive. They'll be able to do more with less. And so our GDP numbers will go up. But the only way to do that is if you actually start using these things to help you with coding or help you with writing those marketing emails. I just saw actually a report today out from Anthropic who use Claude. You talked about Claude. So they said, we started looking at anonymized prompts that people are putting into Claude to get a sense of what jobs are most likely to be displaced by this or to be, helped by this. Yeah. And it was absolutely in coding, it was in sales and any kind of technical writing or any job that involves writing, which is not great for me as a journalist.
Well, I disagree with that. I think the original writing will become more valuable.
Yes, I agree. And this is why when I do write my columns now, I really try and interview people, tell people stories, get quotes in there, pick up the phone, because that's things that AI can't do. But I just wanted to go back to another point that you made, which just makes, this issue of, you talked about your son using this system to make a movie, and maybe he didn't make it, the AI made it. And I think that people talk about the democratization of AI and these tools, and that's great. Where it gets worrying is when it becomes an over-reliance. When people over-rely on social media, for example, they don't hang out with their friends in person. And I think when people over-rely on AI to write their reports, to write their emails, they're not using their brain as much. So I am concerned much less about the singularity and more about these, it's actually hard to measure, this abstract, but I think very real phenomenon of a potential erosion of our critical thinking skills,
yes,
our
memory, and deep reading, because the easy
deep reading,
I mean, the habit, it seems to me, that is most in jeopardy, if not already dead, is the idea of taking a text as a human being and reading it with great care, because where this points is that books will continue to be written, I'm sure, but then people will ask for digests on their chatbots, and sometimes that's a good idea because sometimes you don't have the time to. But in terms of the brain as a muscle and as part of a healthy civic society, an atom within that, that's not healthy.
Yeah.
If you are delegating all of those cognitive tasks to AI in the name of saving time.
Because your employer wants you to be more productive.
Saving time for what?
Yes.
Is often my question.
Yeah.
You know, and why I always worry a bit about this argument that you have to know AI to keep your job, because it seems a lot of the time that really the inexorable logic of that is to replace your job. So
that you can do something else.
Well, yes, but what again? Then
what is that thing?
What is
That's
that thing?
the big question. Nobody knows. They're still figuring out. Like, I was talking to a hedge fund that's using this stuff, and I was like, well, how are you using AI? Oh, it's taking all this market data and it's producing a report which we give to our portfolio manager. Who normally does that job? The junior analyst. Right. Okay, so what's the junior analyst do? Higher level work. So what is the higher level work? Well, they don't really know yet. They're figuring that out. So maybe there is higher level work, but we don't know what that is. And this is especially going to affect people leaving university, college graduates getting, because it's the intern roles and the entry-level jobs that are being displaced by AI first.
And let's not be naive. Most business chief execs will be sitting there. They won't be thinking, oh, how can we deploy these junior people to greater, higher level work? They'll be thinking, how can we make them redundant as quickly as possible? So the profit margin goes.
But they shouldn't, right? Because how are they going to? But how are they going to train up? That's so short-sighted. Isn't
AI
it?
doesn't have a pension.
No salary, no pension, no benefits.
One extraordinary fact about AI, which seemed to sum it all up in this story in your book, Demis Hassabis is not a chemist, is he?
He's a neuroscientist.
But he has won the Nobel Prize for chemistry.
Yes.
And that seemed to me, in a way, to encapsulate both the potential and the sort of shock and awe of AI. Is he won the Nobel Prize for chemistry over research into something called protein folding, which is this extraordinary, complex problem that suddenly his developments in AI could solve. But he's not a chemist, but he's the Nobel laureate for chemistry. And does that give you hope that actually we've talked about a lot of the problems and the erosion of intelligence and the potential singularity nightmares and all of this, but maybe those people who are saying, well, this will solve more problems than it creates are the right people? No. You don't? Okay.
I don't know. I think that's not the answer you're expecting, but it doesn't give me hope, actually. I'm pleased that Demis, for him, because he's been wanting a Nobel for years, and that was the carrot he dangled in front of his staff, was like, we've got, carrot's not the right word, but that was like, that's how he measured success. We've got to win some Nobel Prizes, 2 or 3 over the next 10 years. And that's what he would tell his staff. He's finally won it. But if you look at the number of people at DeepMind who actually worked on protein folding, it's a tiny team. It's about between 9 and 15 people. Right. And there's something like 1,500 people working at DeepMind. So I think awards like that, as they paint this wonderful picture of what's possible with AI, but they also provide a lot of cover for what's really going on in AI, which is that the vast majority of the resources are going towards making a product for Google, ultimately.
To make money, ultimately.
To make money. And I mean, just look at DeepMind's website, in the last 10, 15 years, it started off being all about AGI and all the good things it would do for healthcare and new sources of energy. And you can see all this on the Wayback Machine online, Internet Archive. Now you look at the website and it's all about, here's this new Gemini model, and here's how businesses can use this model to elevate their workforce and elevate their productivity. So there's a change in tone, absolute change in focus at these companies. And it's actually annoyed me a little bit that he got that prize, because it's taken the focus away from that, and it makes it look like these companies are doing great things for humanity, when really that's not their focus at all.
Is it too cynical to say, in the end, all this is about power? Because I can't get out of my head the image of Bezos, Zuckerberg, Musk, Tim Cook, Altman was there too, Sundar Pichai was there at the inaugural. This row of mountains,
Yeah.
knowing that they'd got what they wanted.
Yeah.
And at that moment, a new oligarchy was born. It had been coming in various forms for many years.
Yeah.
But that was they were inaugurated too.
Yes. Yeah.
And I felt, all these moral and ethical questions, don't get me wrong, they're absolutely central and key and core. But in the end, is what this is going to do, in the same way as Altman and Hasebius ended up having to go to the corporations to get to do what they wanted to do, end up with a very small group of mega corporations running the planet.
Yeah.
Is that too dark? Am I not allowing enough light into the
I don't
calculation?
I don't think it's dark at all. I think it's bang on what's happening. That is absolutely the direction we are going in. And in a way, I don't begrudge these guys because they run publicly traded companies. And, if you look at it purely from a business perspective.
Oh, we say, hey, have our data. Yeah, here it is.
Well, no, they have a fiduciary duty to their shareholders to make money and to grow profits. And they've talked about self-regulating. I was talking about the ethics board that Demis wanted with Google. That ended up never happening. DeepMind wanted to spin out. They were so desperate to keep AGI away from Google, and Google wouldn't let that happen either because they're a business. They're not an NGO. And so the real thing that needs to change here is that governments need to step up, which is why when Keir Starmer gave his 50-point AI action plan, sounds great for growth, but no, this is the role of the government right now has to be as a regulator, don't get so obsessed with industrial policy. Right now, this is a critical juncture. You talked about an inflection point, and it's true. The power is just consolidating into just a few hands, and we need legislation and we need guardrails.
But I don't mean to. I mean, I know that government officials use computers, but I mean culturally, government, liberal democracy is so analog, isn't it? I mean, its assumptions are based upon a world of institutions, not networks.
Yeah.
And it is just not designed to deal. It doesn't have the cultural resilience to deal with these sort of perma shocks coming at them. I want you to be right, but I'm not sure what government as presently constituted has the capacity to do it.
Yeah.
Am I wrong?
I mean, I try to be optimistic about what the government can do. And honestly, this week, already, I feel a little bit naive for having felt this way.
Right.
Because we've got, as we speak right now, the Paris AI Action Summit is taking place. And you've got government leaders have come in to talk about how to deal with AI. And what's crazy to me is this summit used to be called the AI Safety Summit when it was started here in the UK at Bletchley Park. And then it moved to Seoul last year, and now it's taking place at Paris. And they changed the name to AI Action Summit. I think there's been just Keir Starmer is another example of this shift in focus away from governments seeing themselves as providing oversight on this stuff to just wanting to race ahead and create national champions and stay in the race and stoke innovation. So, okay,
you've got Emmanuel Macron as one of the two hosts, Modi being the other, saying, the AI Act that the EU's passed is great, but let's not stifle dynamism.
Yeah.
Always in the end.
It depends.
Always in the end.
Sometimes dynamism is good to be stifled if you're hurtling towards the edge of a cliff.
Yeah, it depends what kind of dynamism.
Slow down.
Yeah, slow down.
I agree. There's no,
and then you get
why
called,
go
then
so
you get
fast?
called a decel, don't you?
Yeah, decel or a Luddite.
The decel, yeah.
But I mean, I think the other thing, I wouldn't discount also just other crazy things coming up in the market like DeepSeek. Right?
Yes.
Like DeepSeek, that's why we had a market crash a couple of weeks ago, is because this little company out of China makes this model for a fraction of the price that these other big companies have been building their models. And not only that, they put the blueprints on the internet.
Yeah.
So anyone can do what they did, including all the scientists at Microsoft and Google are poring over those details because they're going to, in the next few weeks, we're going to see models come out that are built on what DeepSeek has built, just using their own innovations.
Amazing.
So it's possible that will help kind of just temper that race to power, that concentration. and that need, because you don't necessarily need all the money, billions of dollars to build AI. DeepSeek showed you just need a few million.
Yes.
Listen, Parmy, we could talk, and I hope, by the way, you'll come back on.
Oh, please come back.
At some point. I mean, this game is moving so quickly.
So fast.
That,
Yeah.
in a year's time, it'll be a totally different conversation, I'm sure.
Yeah.
Come back.
Thank you so much. The book,
Oh, my
folks,
pleasure.
is
Thank
called
you.
Supermacy, the AI, ChatGPT, and the Race That Will Change the World. Parmy Olson is the author. Get it. It's a fantastic read.
Great read.
Before you do that, though, subscribe to the New European. That's the most important thing.
In that
Original,
order.
no AI involved
That's
at all.
the algorithm.
Human brains thinking away for you every single week.
You've got to have a sticker on the magazine that says
AI
human made.
free.
Yeah.
Exactly.
Yeah.
Brilliant. So go to theneweuropean.co.uk/2Matts. And there's a special gift waiting for you when you subscribe. Send in any questions, any feedback from this great podcast or from any of our previous podcasts or anything else that's going on in the world. Send in your questions to 2mats@tnepublishing.com. Thank you as ever to our production team led by Matt Hill from Rethink Audio. Parmy, thanks again for coming.
Thank you for having me.
And everybody else, have a great week.
And we'll see you Thursday.
See you Thursday.